And until we step up and take that responsibility, we're not going to become co-creators with that divine force. And we're going to experience a lot of self-inflicted suffering as a result of being unconscious co-creators under natural law. So that's what really the Christian Rosicrucian allegory is about. It's about that force that wants us to step up and take the reins and become conscious co-creators, evolving ourselves, driving our own evolutionary force through an act of will. That's what the occult teachings have always been about. It's not been about following a leader. It's not been about worshiping at the altar of any other. It's been about emulating higher consciousness, looking at the archetypal higher consciousness or perfected consciousness that we look at as the divine or as God, and deciding, I want to be like that. Okay, so that's what we have to see the Christ consciousness as. We can become like that. We can emulate that. We can take that on in our lives and act like that. You know, I don't think that the figure of Jesus, whether it's allegorical or if he existed as a historical figure, regardless of what you believe in that capacity, wanted us to worship him and just follow what he said. He wanted us to look at what he said, decide whether it was right, whether it was true, whether it was beneficial to all of us, and decide that we wanted to enact that way of being in the world through an act of our own will. Whether we wanted to consciously choose, yes, this is how I'm going to live, this is how I'm going to be in the world, you know, and emulate his decision to do that. That's the decision that being made, that great teacher made. He wanted us to emulate that more than anything else, not to fall down at his feet and worship him and make a religion out of him, you know, centered around him. He wanted us to say, what was I saying? Look at what I said. Look at how I lived. And then do that. Do that by an act of your own will. Live like that, deliberately, consciously. So that's the Christian Rosicrucian, as the allegorical founder of this tradition, is the allegorical Christ. He is the Christ consciousness, just like Hiram Abiff is the savior figure or Christ consciousness in Freemasonry. Okay? So the story of Christian Rosicrucians is told in the manifestos of the Rosicrucian order. And you mentioned them in the introduction to the show. We can look at what Christian Rosicrucian's journey was when we take a look at the Fama Fraternitatis. As Bob said earlier, this was basically put forward in 1614. The Rosicrucian order had, of course, existed for at least a few hundred years before that. And as I've said, this is an ancient tradition that goes back for thousands of years, really, the teachings. In the modern incarnation, some people say the early 1400s is when it really came into being as an actual esoteric order. So the Fama Fraternitatis is known as the discovery of the fraternity. And this means the uncovering, the unveiling, in the sense of to discover something is to discover it, to take the cover away or to take the veil away. Okay? Some people will call this the tradition of the fraternity because it's talking about its core values, what its teachings really are, the ideas that it really wants to put forward and promulgate. Okay? So this document explains, it was put forward in 1614, and it explains the origins of Rosicrucianism, of Rosicrucian teachings, and the Rosicrucian order. It talks about Christian Rosicrucian as the founder of the order. Again, it doesn't specifically state allegorical founder, but we know that this is an allegory. It's not an actual physical human being, a historical being. It documents his travels. Okay, he travels to the east to gain more knowledge. Again, this could also be symbolic, but again, it could also mean he went to the east to learn about the Eastern traditions. Okay, and then he comes back to Germany and he teaches these traditions, and he forms the Rosicrucian fraternity, and he bases the fraternity on vows of piety and unswerving dedication to heal other individuals. And he doesn't mean in a physical or doctoral sense, like a doctor would heal someone or a physician or something like that. He means healing their spirit, healing their worldview, healing their existential angst, okay, healing their imbalance, the spiritual imbalances, the emotional imbalances within, healing themselves of their erroneous ideologies that are not based in truth, that are not based in natural law, that actually do harm to other living beings, okay? Healing their poisoned worldview, their hatred for other people, or just their pure egoism where they only want to serve themselves and have no desire for to put any effort toward the service to others. In the Fama Fraternitatis, Christian Rosicrucian also basically forms this building, okay? He called it the Sanctus Spiritus, the house of the Spirit, okay? The sanctuary of the Spirit. This is kind of an allegorical correlation to the Temple of Solomon in Freemasonry. It really represents the self. Again, this is an allegory. It's a tale that's basically using symbolism and representations, one thing representing something else. Okay, so this temple, this Sanctus Spiritus, or the house of the Spirit, is the temple of the self. And we need to put the same care that Christian Rosicrucian used in filling that temple with knowledge, to fill ourselves with knowledge, with information about our higher selves. Okay? So, again, it's an allegorical correlation to, in Freemasonry, the Temple of Solomon. Okay? It's the self. It's the house of the self. The temple within man, as it has been called. The death of Christian Rosicrucian is basically recounted, and how he passed on information through word of mouth to others and basically formed a tight-knit unit that would then pick their successors in the order and hand down the teachings through books, allegorical teachings, and communication by word of mouth. The orders were given to keep the order secret for 100 years and then to come out and openly teach in the light of day. Presumably because perhaps it may have been too dangerous to come out directly in that time period. That's one possible explanation. Another possible explanation is that the people were just too underdeveloped consciously and spiritually to grasp the teachings until they had planted small seeds, and then be able to work them up to a higher level of consciousness such that they could even grasp the teachings to begin with. And even today, there are many people who it would be difficult to put these gems before of these teachings, because they're so willing to slap them right out of your hand in their ignorance, because they've not really ever exercised the mind. They've not really ever exercised the spirit, the emotional qualities within themselves, and the intellectual capacities that they carry. And they're very underdeveloped, just like someone whose muscles have atrophied in the physical world. Who are not ready to pick up large weights. Okay, it's the same basic principle. So it's a stepwise progression, and that was hinted at in the Fama Fraternitatis, that many would not be ready to hear this, just that they weren't in the story of Christ. Were not ready to hear his teachings, and so put him to death in a painful way. And again, this is allegorical. Trying to communicate the truth to someone is a battle. Trying to communicate the truth to someone often makes you hated, because they want to stay in their level of ignorance, and they want to stay in their level of not accepting personal responsibility. They subconsciously know that ignorance is equated with the lack of responsibility. And that's why we don't give children totally responsible positions until they have grown up and learned and understand more about how the world works. Then they can come into a position of responsibility. But spiritually, it's as if humanity wants to remain eternal cosmic infants and don't want to develop any responsibility by way of taking on knowledge unto themselves. So that's hinted at in this document, but basically it's saying that the fraternity needs to communicate these teachings. That's what they're charged with doing. And that's their great work. That is their task. That is their labor of love, so to speak. Okay? So we could look at the death of Christian Rosicrucian and how he was buried in a sarcophagus at the center of this crypt, and they put all these writings on the crypt. Okay? And his body was said to have been discovered again by an initiate of the order 120 years after his death, and he did not decay at all. You know, he was perfectly preserved, and his flesh did not actually decay as it usually does after death. This is also an allegory for saying that these teachings are basically eternal for the most part. They are basically truths about how nature works, and they will not really degrade with time. Okay, you could teach them now, and they'll be as valid now as they'll be as valid 1,000 years from now as they are right now. And the inscriptions, I'd like to just briefly take a look at these, because these are really this along with a couple of other basic tenets are the real meat of this document, and the real core teachings that are attempting to be communicated allegorically. So on the crypt of Christian Rosicrucian is written 4 statements, and then there is one that is basically an overarching statement. So we can liken these to the 4 arms of the cross and the rose. Okay? The 4, I guess you could say, underpinning statements they're all written in Latin, and I'll translate them accordingly. Let's see if I can get this pronunciation right. The first one is nequaquam vacuum. Okay? And that means, by no means does a vacuum exist. Okay, and what is meant by that in this teaching is that everything is alive. Everything has living dynamic energy. There's no such thing as empty. There's no such thing as some place where there isn't spirit. Everything is part of the all. Okay, everything is energy. Everything is living. Everything is part of the all mind. Okay? This is a big part of Rudolf Steiner's teachings, that everything is part of the one, and everything is unified at a fundamental level. And quantum mechanics and modern science is telling us that there is a unified field level of reality at which there's no differentiation between anything. Okay? This is borne out by modern science, and it's one of the tenets of all Rosicrucian teachings. Another one, the second one is Legis Jugum, okay? And this means the yoke of the law. This means that natural law is always in place. Natural law exists at all times and places. And they say yoke of the law because we really are under natural law. Okay? We're not really truly free in the sense that we can choose to break natural law, but there are consequences for doing so that we must experience. In other words, the universe is like a huge mirror bringing back that which we put out into it. That's it. What goes in is what we experience. What we put into it is what we experience. So what goes in comes out. Garbage in, garbage out. Good stuff in, good stuff out. And it's up to us what we input through our thoughts, emotions, and our actions, what we are putting out into the field. Okay? And then that is expressed in the realm of manifestation, in the material realm, and we experience it. This is unwavering. It is unbreakable law. It's immutable. The universe just works that way. Okay? And this is a hard one for people to grasp. People don't like that idea. They don't want to accept the notion that we are responsible for what we are creating, but in fact that's the reality. That's the underpinning reality. Nothing can change that, whether we like it or not, or even whether we understand it or not. So that's the second thing that is written on this sarcophagus. Another one is Libertas Evangelii, and that means the inviolate glory, that means the freedom of the good news, or of the gospel. What that means is the gospel is basically the teachings of natural law, the communication of the knowledge of how natural law works. Okay? And that's good news. That is very good news. Okay?